Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading true, scary deep woods stories. I hope you enjoy them. Now, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. I'm new to the group, so I wanted to share an experience that I had back in the spring of 2018. I've had a few of what could be considered paranormal experiences in my life, but this was the most recent and unnerving. I'm an avid outdoorsman, and I love to hunt and camp around the Francis Marion and Sumter National Forest. Back in 2018, I took my young son and dog out to a remote area in the National Forest to test out a new camper shell on my recently purchased truck. We found a secluded area off a dirt road, made dinner, and then packed it in for the night as soon as it got dark. Around 11 p.m. at night, I sat up and looked out the back of the truck due to my dog growling. In the distance, I saw what looked like hundreds of small white balls of light darting around, then hovering for a few seconds and slowly converging to our campsite. They looked just like the dust orbs you see on videos, but these were producing light in a completely dark forest. They soon surrounded my truck. Seemed like hundreds of them. They were soft white light, and they didn't blink. Lightning bugs were out early evening, but those were yellow and blinking. After 30 minutes of them floating around and concentrating around us, I finally worked up the nerve to open the truck and lit a lantern, and they promptly disappeared. After turning off the lights and looking back up, they came back. My son was fast asleep, thank God. I watched them until I finally fell asleep again around 1 a.m. The next morning when we tried to leave, the battery was dead on the new truck. There weren't any lights in the back cab, where we would have used any power. A week later, I had to replace the electric control module. Not sure if that is relevant info, but I thought that I would add it. Has anyone had any similar experiences? Just thinking about them again makes the hair stand up on my neck. I was hiking in the Catskills. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I come up to the Catskills fairly regularly throughout the year because sometimes the Poconos get a little boring. I started at the trailhead parking lot where I parked my car and began walking up the same trail that I've walked up 1,000 times. After about an hour, I started to feel kind of weird. It felt like the woods were a little bit quieter than they usually were when I had come up here before, but I wasn't initially very concerned about it. After I sat down to have breakfast, I started hearing rustling above me, and some sticks fell down right behind me. I wasn't really worried about this earlier, as I just assumed it was some squirrels running around or some chipmunks throwing things at me. This has happened to me before. I finished my breakfast without incident, and kept walking towards the summit. This was fairly early in the morning, around 6 a.m., so I would think there would be a lot of birds chirping and a lot of other activity. But things just kept getting quieter and quieter as I ascended. This definitely creeped me out, but I tried to push it out of my mind because I've already been hiking for a while at this point, and I'm definitely not turning around. Eventually, more sticks fell to my right, somewhat close to me, and they sounded heavier. These were the kind of small twigs that would generally fall from squirrel activity. I went over and checked them, and these were fairly substantial. This continued to happen in a higher frequency until I finally reached the end of the trail. On my way back, it happened continuously, increasing in frequency as I descended, until suddenly, it just kind of stopped when I was about a mile from the car. When I finally returned to my car, I found all of the doors open, and it seemed like a lot of my stuff had been very violently rummaged through. I had a bag in there with some of my clothes in it, and this had been torn up. A lot of my clothes were outside the car, leading back into the woods. I thought about calling the police, but I live in Philadelphia, so I knew that there wasn't really anything that was going to happen. To this day, I still get freaked out when I think about it. I don't necessarily think that it was connected, but I do feel really uneasy about both of these things happening at the same time. But then again, maybe I was just robbed. In February of last year, me and a bunch of my friends went camping at Moss Park, a county park to the southeast of Orlando. This county park is on a forested island with 2 large lakes to the east and west, and 2 extensive nature preserves to the north and south. We were just hanging around the campfire drinking beers and smoking pot. Around 11 p.m., me and 3 of the friends decided to go for a walk into the nature preserve to the south. Our destination was a dock on a pond/cove of the large lake to the west. I normally am not the type to go walking outside in the woods at dark. I do a lot of hiking, but always during the daytime hours. I guess being slightly inebriated and with some friends made me feel braver than usual. So we went trekking off into the woods in the dark with nothing but a flashlight to protect us. At first, the trail was taking us through a large swamp, and nothing felt out of the ordinary. Next, the trail entered a thick pine forest. Here, things began to feel a bit different, and in retrospect, it was very quiet, but I wasn't concerned at the time. We got to the dock and started shining the flashlight around, hoping to see some alligators. There were no alligators, no bugs, and no signs of life in general. I thought it was a bit odd, but again, I wasn't too concerned. Then all of a sudden, something changed. Within a few seconds, all 4 of us said something along the lines of, "Do you feel that?" Something all of a sudden felt very wrong. Then one of my friends said, "Listen to how quiet it is." We all shut up and listened. It was insanely quiet. Not a single frog, insect, or bird. Even the wind had stopped. It was the quietest thing I had ever heard in my life. It was like we were inside of a vacuum. Remembering this lack of sound gives me chills to this day. Next, we all remarked how cold it was getting. I started getting goosebumps. It felt like the barometric pressure had just plummeted. At this point, we all agreed that we needed to get the F out of there. There was a strong feeling of impending danger, like something wanted us to leave ASAP, and we would be in big trouble if we didn't. I was able to feel that all of this energy was coming from across the pond towards us. I think all of my friends could feel this as well, because we were all focused on the pond. Nobody was paying any attention to the dark woods behind us. It felt like a charge of energy was running through my body, and I could feel exactly the direction that this energy was coming from. We all agreed that we had to leave and started walking back at a fast pace. The bad feelings were still present while we were walking back through the pine forest. One of my friends actually started crying. I wasn't too worried though. It felt like we would be okay as long as we kept walking. Once the trail exited the pine forest and entered the swamp, all the bad feelings were immediately lifted. It was like we had crossed some sort of threshold and everything felt fine again. I think we may have been run off by a Sasquatch, because I've seen them myself on a few occasions, and I've heard that they can put these bad feelings into people. But we didn't see anything, so I can't say for sure what it was. About 15 minutes after getting back to the campfire where the rest of our friends were, we heard what sounded like someone or something whacking a tree with a big stick, one time just across the campground. This may have been related to what happened earlier. The campground host immediately got up and started walking around with a light, as if they were equally surprised by this sound, or possibly this kind of thing had happened before. I had to leave the next morning to go to work, but some of my friends stuck around and went back to the dock during the daylight hours, and they reported that nothing was out of the ordinary this next time. I still go hiking a lot, but I'm not planning on doing any more hiking in the dark. I felt like we were in legitimate danger, like whatever it was could have made us disappear if we didn't leave as soon as we did. So a little bit of background. I'm from Spain with family from Italy. This story is 100% true. Me, my dad, and my brother are all 3 familiar with camping, nature, etc. We don't get scared easily, and we aren't really superstitious or whatever. Also, excuse me for any grammatical errors I might make in this. English isn't my first language. But anyway, now on to the story. This happened in 2010, I believe. I was 8 years old, and we were on summer vacation in Italy, in the region of Tuscany, where some of our family is from. We, my brother, dad, and me, were hiking in the country far away from any towns or any other form of big civilization. We were not very familiar with this route, though. All of a sudden, we stumble across what looks like an abandoned Tuscan farmhouse. Not very big, though. We all look around and yell, asking whether there was someone. It looked very abandoned. The door was missing. Plants all growing over the place. Safe to say, no one lived there. So since we love adventure and it didn't seem like a bad plan to do with 2 children, we decided to take a look at the place. As we're going to enter the house, out of nowhere comes a barn owl flying out of the house. It was dark in there. So we had a quick scare, but nothing too bad. It's just an owl, right? Now we enter the house and we just find the typical stuff that you would imagine to find when you're in an abandoned house. Cutlery and plates on the ground, a candle, some old paintings. Nothing really valuable though. Now we see an old wooden ladder that leads up to a hole in the ceiling. It was not a very big hole. My father couldn't fit. To give you an idea, he's like 6'2". And so, since I was the oldest of the 2 kids, I would go up and tell them what I saw upstairs. Now I went up the ladder and I got in a room where I could barely see because the windows were covered with wood boards. So I could make out some stuff by a few sun rays that would get in through the gaps. I could see graffiti signs, typical for an abandoned house, right? And I saw another room, so I told my father and brother that I would advance to there and see what was up. As I opened the rotten wooden door, I immediately stood still. A disgusting, rotten smell penetrated my nose. I almost had to throw up. I wanted to know what caused this bad smell. Then, in the corner of the room, I could make out a silhouette. I got closer to investigate what it could be, and I could barely make out that it was the lifeless body of a dog. A big dog. And spicy detail, the body was skinned. No fur or anything. Just pure rotting flesh in the shape of a big dog. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, but I woke up from my shock with the screams of my brother, because apparently the barn owl had gotten back inside the house and had almost hit him. So my dad yelled at me to come back and I gladly obeyed. When I got back downstairs, I told him what I had seen, and the look that he gave me was that of a man who was scared to crap, but doesn't want to admit it in order not to scare his young kids. He just got close to my ear and whispered to run. We ran out of that place and never got back, or even close to the route leading to it. Now, it might not be very scary compared to other stories on this page or very backwoods related, but I thought I'd give it a go since someone said that they wanted to hear stories from outside the Northern America sphere. It was still in the country part and there were woods around it though. I'm sorry in advance for my English. When I was a teenager around 2004, we used to sneak down through a quiet area of scrub over the dunes on the beach to smoke weed. I lived in a very small coastal town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Typical wildlife was possums, wallabies, and maybe the occasional kangaroo. Definitely no dingoes, crocs, or other apex predators around. One night, as we quietly made our way down the path, we noticed a shuffling, rustling sound in the undergrowth near the path. We stopped moving, and the sound seemed to stop as well. There was absolutely zero light except from some houses in the distance and the moon. After a brief pause, we decided to keep moving. We heard the rustling sound again, and this time noticed some bushes moving. We stopped, and my friend whispered, "Holy crap, did anyone else see the trees move?" I whispered back, "I only saw the bushes move." We stood there frozen for a few beats. In my head, I was weighing up the option to either continue on the path or leg it back home. We took a few more steps forward when we heard the sound like leaves crunching underfoot. At this point, I reached out and grabbed my friend's hand, thinking maybe we were being followed by someone. It was right then that I noticed I could smell something awful. "What's that smell?" my mate whispered. His voice came out so small it frightened me even more. We stood there for so long, but probably only a minute or two, until we heard a low groan/growl sound coming from a few meters away. Now, brushtail possums are quite common to the area, and are known to make a kind of grunting/coughing sound, but they are, at least the ones I've ever heard, distinctly higher pitched and more chirpy sounding than what we heard. This was a low and more sonorous sound, kind of like a with some scratching sounds at the end. Needless to say, we wordlessly booked it right back up the path the way we came. It sounded to me like a huge commotion of leaves crunching and branches shaking and crashing behind us as we ran. But reflecting on it with my adult hindsight, it definitely could have been us making all that noise. We never went back to that spot again, and would bring it up from time to time, trying to speculate what could have followed us that night. Our best theories were that it was a big possum, or a person trying to scare us. The biggest issues we would argue over was why would a possum follow us, let alone down on the ground? Although my mate says that he heard tree branches moving as well. And if it was a person, how did they make that sound? And what was the smell? And why didn't we hear any footfall? Maybe it was just a coincidence of events. A person following us, a nearby possum growling, and a nearby dead animal stink wafting over at just the right moment. But it still makes me shiver to think about it now. I mentioned this story in a reply to someone else a while back, and I thought I'd give it its own thread. Location is a campground that may or may not be currently accessible. I know it was closed, gated off from the road, for quite a while, a good few years ago. Factory Shoals Campground, a good 20 minutes outside of Covington, Georgia. Yes, that's where they filmed the Vampire Diaries. Anyway, Factory Shoals Recreation Area, the campground. I'll say that I've never seen many other people out at this huge park, even on the nicest days, but a friend lives in a subdivision down the road. The area is sporadically rural, if that makes sense. You'll come across a school, a gas station, and a pretty big neighborhood, but nothing else for another 6 or 7 minutes down the road. The campground is next to the Alcovey River. In order to reach it, you have to drive through Newton Factory Cemetery, an old cemetery with mostly older graves sitting on the side of the road, slightly hidden by trees, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. I've often wondered about this. The graves date back to the 1800s. Maybe illegible ones are even older. And at some point someone says, "Hey, let's put a road through the cemetery and create a campground." So you go down this janky road through the cemetery about a quarter mile, and there you are, barely managed campground. There's maybe 7 sites, mostly next to the river. I'm with a friend. It's a nice evening. The light bustling of the river is calming. There's only one other campsite occupied a bit down. No street lamps. The only light you have is the fire in your flashlight. So when we're headed to bed, fire extinguished, it's pitch black. You can see the stars. There must not have been a moon that night. I'm laying down and closing my eyes, and I realize it's too quiet. Deafening silence. I jump back up and go to my friend's tent and tell her that I'm suddenly feeling really creeped out. We both realize the bugs and even the river have gone silent. To be fair, the river is only about 8 foot across and about 2 feet deep here. We had commented on the peaceful lull of the river all through the evening. With curiosity stronger than fear, we walk over towards the water and observe a mist or fog lifting from the water. We're a little anxious and don't want to get right up on the bank to see if we can see the water moving. So my friend remembers a light-up fishing lure type thing that she has in her bag. She fetches it, tosses it in, and it just sits there. It doesn't flow down. So it's like the river came to a complete stop in its movement, is releasing a thick mist, and is completely dark and silent, except for that lure and its faint red glow barely visible through the thick mist. We both kind of start muttering that we should maybe pack up quick and leave before I see the spark and hear a gun firing not 15 feet away from us. shine a light for a split second before we're both in the car. It's cranked, and we're tearing out of there. I didn't see anyone either from shining my light or from the headlights, and I about had a panic attack coming through the cemetery after that with the elongated shadows from headstones and monuments. I didn't sleep that evening, even after crashing on my friend's couch. Logic tells me the quiet could have come from a prowling human with a gun, but the mist and a river current stopping, and what if the who/whatever followed us? I didn't even gather my tent and sleeping bag before going home the next day. I luckily had placed my bag in my car for some reason instead of taking it inside, so my only loss was the small old tent, the sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and a camp chair. So it's maybe a year later and I'm in the area with my husband, and he doesn't believe me about the campground on the other side of a cemetery. It's midday and I decide to show him. Pull up, and I see that the road is now blocked off beyond the graves, with a sign that states the campground is currently closed. We get out a minute to walk around the cemetery. It's a dirt road. There's a lot of kicked up dust settling. So much that my husband asks if there's water in my trunk. He's coughing. I go to get it, cursing under my breath at the thick layer of settled dust already on my precious sports car. And I notice a very clean and distinct fresh tiny handprint on my trunk. It had to be really fresh, because I stood there and watched the still settling dirt start to stick and fill it in. We'd never made it more than a few feet from the car. There's nobody else out there. Again, we book it out of there. I know there's a legend about parking cars on hills in certain areas at night, and you'll find little handprints on the back and your car will have moved. My car didn't move, but those were legit fresh little handprints. I'm not sure if the cemetery brings playful souls. The entire area holds on to some type of energy, or there's just some incredibly sneaky people that hang out in a minimally trafficked woods and back roads. I'll reiterate that this is part of a park, a recreational area that has grills and picnic tables about 3 minutes down the road, and I never saw anyone there the few times I visited aside from my friend, husband, or the other tent that I saw further down the river when we tried to camp. I've never gone back. I've been to other places in Newton County, though, that offer similar vibes. The Alcovey Trestle, Gaither Plantation, a random church smack dab in the middle of the woods, that creepy old gas station, but never back to the place that was in this story. And that's it. That's all that happened. That's the story. I was tree planting near Smithers, British Columbia, about an hour and a half into the mountains on old dirt roads. I tried my best to just forget this incident even occurred, as I simply could not find a way to rationalize what happened. I don't care who believes me or not, by the way, but what happened is this. It was almost midnight and I was trying to sleep in my tent. My tent was near a bunch of standing dead trees that would creak when the wind picked up. A very loud and distinct sound. Now on this particular night, it was dead silent and still. I started to hear sticks cracking and steps being taken that slowly got closer over the course of about 15 minutes. I was loud enough that I was certain that there was a bear approaching my tent. It got so close that it had to be no further than 15 feet away from me, cracking sticks and padding around the forest floor. I decided to yell out very loudly. Silence. I was answered with nothing but deafening silence. No sound of the creature fleeing or doing anything at all. I sat in silence, too scared to move, trying to rationalize to no conclusion. About 20 minutes of dead silence later, I heard the eeriest, unnatural, and unexplainable noise. It was the exact same timbre and volume, and just basically the same sound as the trees outside creaking. But instead of being a regular creak, it began, and then held the exact same note of creak for a full 5 seconds or even longer. It was like an unnatural drone that was obviously not a tree creaking. There was not a hint of wind or any other trees creaking as per usual. I got barely any sleep, and the next day was tough, and I just had to forget about it. I didn't ever make the connection that skinwalkers are known to imitate sounds like that until a few weeks ago. This happened in July of 2022. If anyone has had a similar experience, or has any ideas of what this could have been, I'd love to hear. So me and my boyfriend were in my 4th floor apartment last night around 1 a.m. I don't live out in the wilderness, but my apartment is in the corner of the building, where one side faces toward a green belt directly outside, and one side faces towards a fairly busy street near my university. I was asleep, and my boyfriend was next to me playing on my PC when he woke me up and said that he thought a cat had been hit by a car outside and was going to go check it out. I was half asleep and didn't really process what he said until about a minute after he left. So I called him and asked what made him think that there was a cat out there. He told me that he could hear it and to go out on my balcony, and I would be able to hear it too. I got up and walked into my living room, and already I heard awful screaming outside nearby the woods, without even having to step outside. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. I frequently hear coyotes howling/yipping, but this was nothing at all like that. Granted, I have never heard a dying animal before, but it didn't sound like a cat or anything familiar. I felt very uneasy and called my boyfriend and told him to come back. At this point, he had reached the area where the suspected animal likely was, in a small and shallow drainage ditch at the edge of the woods that goes under the street. He told me when he got back that he had leaned over the railing by the sidewalk, and suddenly, the screaming, coming from directly below, stopped and turned into some sort of loud purring sound. He also said that when he reached the spot, it was as if the sound changed location. However, it was too dark to see, and he was getting a bit spooked and uneasy himself and left. The whole experience had us both very unnerved. Was this likely an animal that was hit by a car? This took place last year, at the beginning of summer. I was with my mom, headed down to my Nana's farm to visit for a weekend. For some context, she lives on a farm way back in the country, right at the foot of a mountain in rural South Carolina. It's a very rural, secluded area, so the roads are badly maintained and barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass one another. The houses are also spread out and set far back into the tree line from the road, so there's very little ambient light besides the headlights of a car. So my mom and I are driving along, her in the driver's seat and me in the passenger. It was around 11 p.m., and we are about 15 minutes from Nana's house, deep in the woods with the radio down to almost silent. We come onto this straight stretch of road in a heavily wooded area, and suddenly this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving pretty good, but both me and my mom were able to get a good look at it, and we both agree on what we saw. It was a fairly large creature, roughly the size of a person, maybe bigger. Neither of us could make out the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body, my mom's words, as if it were emaciated, and its rib cage was poking out. The reflection of light made it hard for me to tell color, but it moved across the road. It didn't run the way a dog or horse would, with all 4 legs. The best word to describe it would be loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along, and it was moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of, "What the hell is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it just as it reached the other side of the road and out of our headlights, and I swear on my life, it stood up and ran. Not like a dog rearing on its hind legs. It was definitely bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought that I was going insane had I not had another person in the car with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person and not superstitious, but she was very nervous and made me agree to not tell my Nana about it to avoid scaring her, which made me recognize how serious this was. I should also mention that there had apparently been a series of attacks on livestock/horses in the area around the time that this happened. People were saying they found wire fences ripped through and their animals attacked. I don't think any died, but if I remember correctly, there were a few horses that were severely wounded. There have been a few other strange instances in the area, but that was my personal experience. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I was always so amazed at the beauty of Algonquin Park and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages on the lake. During the summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with family and friends. I spent every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sounds of motorboats on the lake. But the winters were different. The people that didn't live there all year would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area mostly deserted, with cottages boarded up for the winter. There were a few people that still frequently would come up every couple of months for a few days or so, but the most part, the lake was silent during the winters, and the town was just filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always all covered with snow, making the forest quiet. Our cottage was on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on the road, with ours being somewhat in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up to the cottage to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend, so I tagged along so we wouldn't be alone and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive from our home, but turned out to be an 8-hour drive due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through Algonquin Park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black except for the headlights of the car. We finally passed through the park with only about 30 minutes left to get to the cottage. It had stopped snowing, and we were both eager to get there. As we turned onto the familiar road, I remember my dad cursing. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the road, I noticed there was a fresh set of tire tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad had said. All of a sudden, as we drove around the bend, following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost hidden by the vast trees that were covered with snow. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past the white van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. I told my dad this and he shrugged. Maybe they're lost. I nodded, but couldn't help to think about how it was a dead-end road and why they would feel the need to park there. As we pulled into our driveway and we started bringing our stuff in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about that van and why it was there, with 2 people just sitting in the dark in the middle of the night. It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him, instead of sleeping downstairs in my room that my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest, and my 15-year-old self was already scared of the dark, even without seeing the white van. It wasn't a big deal when my older sister was there, but not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off, and I was just using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet I could almost hear my ears ringing. I also started to get the feeling that I was being watched. The living room had large windows, also with no curtains, that overlooked the lake. And it was black except for a light or 2 from the cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now that the cottage was dark, the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was beautiful, and I walked towards the window to get a better look. Movement caught my eye, and I remember my heart dropping as I saw 2 figures down by the back porch, below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled towards the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I wasn't sure if they had seen me or not. I woke up my dad, and by the time he got to the window, the 2 figures were gone. Where I had seen the figures, 2 sets of footprints in the snow led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare anyone off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but he still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I remember being very freaked out, and I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified that I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, my dad went outside and confirmed that there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, and then back around to the front of the cottage and back up to the road. There were tire marks that showed the vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed that they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was the middle of winter and not too many people were up at the lake. But they knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading up to our cottage, and my dad's car parked out front. They also may have seen the lamp that I had turned on to read, and/or seeing it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for winter. But again, and I still wonder to this day, why would they be interested in stealing from a house that clearly had people inside it? (2006) Pinnacle Lake Trail, Washington. I was camping with my wife and son, and we decided to go for a hike. We walked probably less than a mile and came across a small trail leading to a kind of small, boggy pond in the rainforest. It was a misty day with light rain. The pond was darkened by tall trees hanging with moss. We were going to venture in there as it was pretty but somewhat creepy. We probably spent 2 minutes navigating our way over and under some downed trees when my wife says, "We need to leave. Now." I asked what was up and she just felt really uneasy, like something bad was present there. I said, "Hun, if you feel that uneasy, then let's go." Her intuition has served her and us well in the past, so I was trusting her instinct. It didn't hurt to simply leave. We made our way back to camp and drove home the next morning. When we arrived home, we saw the local news story of 2 women killed just 2 miles up the trail, the day after we were hiking there. Could my wife had sensed a killer? Or simply some other thing? If we had stayed, could we have died? The case is still unsolved. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories that he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At the time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Portlock River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were the 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bayer and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple of hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river towards them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure that this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged his shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off of my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch Ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there was found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. The creature was never sighted in that area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho wild man. There's actually a newspaper article describing the event. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the Little Lost River Valley, farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He was sure that he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. The Mystery of Portlock, Alaska. The community of Portlock began in Port Chatham Bay in the Kenai Peninsula as a cannery in the early 1900s. Its inhabitants were mainly Russian folk, specifically from the Aleutian Islands, which form a curving archipelago that connects Alaska and Russia while delineating the Bering Sea from Pacific Ocean. In 1921, the community established itself enough to warrant a U.S. post office opening in town. The mysteries of Portlock began only a few short decades after its founding, with the disappearance of some townfolk in the 1940s. Sheep hunters had vanished from the hills surrounding the town, and reportedly their bodies would later be found in the lagoon and waterways, mutilated to a degree of brutality that no one thought a wild animal capable, or even desirous of doing. Mysterious prints from some unfamiliar and massive beast measuring 18 inches long were found by hunters tracking moose in the hills surrounding town. Apparently, when the hunters tracked this mysterious animal, they found no moose, but a massively bloody scene. Melania Kell told the story, according to her memory to the Homer Tribune. When she was only a baby, her family suddenly fled from their seaside home in Port Chatham, a community adjacent to Portlock, leaving their livelihood and all else behind. Her family was not alone. All of the residents of Portlock left their lives behind in terrible fear. According to her, Nantinak had been stalking the townsfolk, a local Sasquatch-like creature that is said to haunt the Kenai Peninsula. She believed her own godfather had been killed by this creature in 1931, when he was struck in the head in a manner that seemed beyond the strength of any human being. Despite being sighted in other regions of the Kenai Peninsula, the beast seemed to favor Portlock most of all, as whispers of a spirit preying on its people traveled throughout the settlements. Were one to write out all of these stories, they would sound very familiar to those of us even with the slightest interest in cryptids. Hunters mysteriously vanishing, glimpses of a hairy beast stalking in the shadow of trees, mysterious sounds that seem to belong to no known beast. But despite this similarity, the stories of the Nantinak have been told far longer than those of Bigfoot. Whatever it was that prowled the wilds around Portlock, it clearly struck a deep and abiding terror in these people. By the early 1950s, Portlock was all but entirely abandoned, marked by the closing of the post office in town. According to Brian Weed, co-founder of a group called Geno's Hidden History, before Portlock began its life as a cannery, it had been host to a small village many years before. It seems those inhabitants also abandoned their fishing camps, reporting that they were being bothered by some beast or spirit. Weed told KINY Radio that later, when the cannery was abandoned, those running it begged the inhabitants to stay, even employing armed guards to assuage their fears. but no amount of begging or precautions seemed to motivate the townspeople to stay. When it's put into perspective just how many people died during this time, this is no surprise. It's said that as many as 36 people went missing from the small village in only 20 years' time. Strangely, Portlock only appeared on the U.S. Census twice, once in 1940 and again in 1980, curiously reporting exactly 31 residents each time. This seemed like it could have been kind of a clerical error, but for some, it adds to the dark mystique of the town's history. Could there be people living there still? Was the area repopulated again in the 80s only to be abandoned once more? According to locals today, the area is markedly haunted and not merely by Nantique lore. Even before Melania's time, there were stories told of other spirits that haunted the Kenai Peninsula, such as that of a pale-faced woman shrouded and draped in long black cloth that dragged in the wet earth behind her. She was said to emerge from the seaside cliffs, screaming and wailing before vanishing back into them. Could this creature that prowled the port town and surrounding wilderness for hundreds of years be a massive lineage of bear? It's hard to imagine that people so intimate with the vast wilderness and all the explicable terrors it holds would be so grasped by such a delirious fear that they'd leave their whole world behind. Perhaps a few too many unthinkable tragedies happen in too short of a time, although dozens of murders or accidents is still hard to explain. Maybe this really was an encounter with the self-same creature we call Bigfoot. If the census is correct, did people try to live in the area again, only to be scared off by the same beast? Portlock is now, by all accounts, a ghost town, home only to crumbling lumber, rusting cannery equipment, and other traces of a once vibrant community. To this day, it's not been settled again, despite its bounty of resources and breathtaking beauty. The sway held by the local lore may keep that land untouched for many years yet. (1994), the hills of Bella Vista, California, east of Redding, south of Lake Shasta. I had guests staying at my remote cabin. One evening, my friend was outside with his wife and ran inside. "You have to come out and see this." I was like, oh crap, now what? As many strange things occurred in those remote woods. I leisurely follow him outside, off the deck and out into the yard. He says, "Look," pointing above the cabin roof. Directly above the cabin are these baseball-sized flashes of blue electricity, like 25 at once or more. They were randomly flashing as if a bunch of cameras were going off. There was no sound to them. I can't recall how long this lasted. Judging from the time they must have seen them, came all the way inside to tell me, and still occurring once I got outside, it must have been at least 3 minutes that the flashes occurred. I lived there for a few years and never experienced this before, but it wasn't entirely surprising. So last year, I went backpacking in the Central Sierras with a friend. We were about to set up camp in a spot just a few feet off trail. I ventured farther away from the trail on this rocky area to get a better view of the lake. If you looked close enough, there was a trail. Not on any map, but a clear trail nonetheless that looked like it led to the base of a peak, which is known for climbing. I started following it and came across the most peculiar camp setup. It wasn't like any backpacking setup I'd ever seen. There were a couple of backpacking tents, but there was also these white foldable tables, a canopy tent and a grill, a full-on cabinet-style backyard grill, clearly heavy equipment that requires at least 2 people to carry each item. The nearest road was 6 miles away, and the only way up to that spot was foot or horse. How the hell did they manage to haul that stuff up there? I didn't see anyone. I saw all that stuff, turned around and let my friend know. She went back up to check it out, but she didn't see anything. Either she didn't walk down the trail far enough, or my mind completely made that up. Maybe the altitude and sun exposure got to me. I don't know. Either way, I didn't feel safe staying there, so we camped somewhere else. Anyone know how that stuff could have gotten up there? My ex-husband and I left a beach town. We were there visiting friends, another couple at their cottage, all day and evening. We just left as the sun went down about 9:30 p.m. We took the highway there, but I hate highway driving, so my ex took the supposed scenic route home. He drove rural roads and we wound up at a stop sign, a T intersection. Turn left or right, no road ahead, only trees. Okay, he went right knowing that we should be west towards our home. Minutes later, we were right back at the stop sign and T intersection. Odd. So my ex turned left, knowing it was the wrong direction, east. He did it anyway. And minutes later, we came to the same stop sign again. I'll add, no embellishments. The road that kept leading us to this stop sign was acres of corn on both sides. Also farmhouses with interior lights on. People home and awake. Anyway, the third time I could tell that he was a bit rattled but wouldn't share. He said, "I'm turning right, and you, me, watch for any road signs." I did, and he did too from the driver's side. Nothing, just tree lines. We ended up back at the same stop sign again. My ex said F this and hit reverse, peeled backwards on the gravel road halfway into a farm driveway and turned around. Then went back the way we'd came/entered the road. From there, we did get home. My ex will never admit the eeriness of that night. Our going on a semi-loop 3 times. Perhaps in the bright light of day, the roads would make sense. But this was the only time I've ever seen my ex frantic or panicked. Even as a skeptic, he knew something was off, continually arriving at the same stop sign. We were also older, in our 40s. I might not be explaining the circumstances well, but it's still the gospel truth. Also, I want to point out my ex had and has an uncanny knack for direction, better now with GPS, etc. He had it innately at this time and before. When he reversed and gunned it backwards, I knew he was afraid. He's a wonderful, kind person. He'll never talk about it though. Or anything weird. That night. So there's a park in Tucker, Georgia, called John's Homestead. What it actually is an old vacant farmhouse that sits awkwardly in disarray along a busy highway. Some 100-year-old homestead donated to the county to build a park and trail system over a few good acres. Although the adjacent highway is often busy, this particular patch could almost pass as the rural back road it once was. The homestead, 2 churches established a century ago, old cemeteries, and a few acres of wood in between bustling urban communities. To be honest, I don't remember much of the history of the place aside from the landowner being named John Johns, and an old picture of him didn't look too happy. I know the entire property creeps me out though. I only went a handful of times, not too far down the trail from the parking area, which is maybe a quarter mile from the homestead. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. It suddenly got quiet. I still made it to the old house, then circled back around. I stopped another time and had the same creepy feeling the whole time. And I'm telling you, you feel so far off the road and into the woods, despite having that highway running virtually right beside you the entire time. So I told myself that I wasn't going back. But I did. One more time. I really wanted to take a stroll before dark, and I was running late coming home, so I pulled over to John's Homestead. I don't remember it feeling too weird on the trail. Maybe it was the heavier evening traffic. I could easily hear through the trees. Maybe it was the 2 middle-aged women on the blanket near the small stream sipping wine. Only time I ever encountered others on the small trail. But the walk to the house was fine. I get to the house, walking around it. I notice how pitch black it seems inside, despite the apparent lack of complete and intact boarding on doors and windows. It's got a chain link around it since it was deemed structurally unsafe. Very suddenly, I realize it's about to get dark on me, and that feeling starts creeping back. So I swiftly walk back towards the trail. I'm just a few steps into the wooded area when I hear a loud thud. Something big hit the ground. My brain is trying to convince me that it was a tree limb, but I immediately realize that there were no snaps or cracks. I look around for just a few seconds, but briskly walk my way out of there and get to my car as it's getting just too dark to see. I didn't think much of it until I read a few days later that human remains were found just a few feet away from where I was standing when I'd heard the noise. Other than a body found, the county never released any identity or any more details, and this was over a year ago. So maybe this little spot in Tucker isn't exactly backwoods now, but what's there that feels off? Why did this one small stretch of woods never get developed? What's so special about this particular crumbling house? It looks so out of place in the bigger picture of the area. What the hell did I hear? Who was found dead? And what happened? My brother is 2 years older than me, and we've probably spent tens of thousands of hours and then some in the woods together. Whether it was building forts/BMX tracks to LARPing and hunting, we've traveled across the US exploring caves, canyons, cliff diving, mountain climbing, camping, hunting white-tailed mule deer, wild boar, etc. since 2016 when we get the time off. I feel like adding this is important because there's genuinely nothing I wouldn't do or fear when I have him by my side, but this time was different and we both felt it. We've had our fair share of adventures and stories to tell of all sorts, but this one has felt like a lingering stain on my memory. We were both mid-20s-ish, and it was 2019, and this was probably my 5th time hunting the area, and the first that I brought my brother along. It's a large forest area of public land that has a few country roads which are basically 2 tracks that stretch miles throughout the area. We make the trip up in my truck with our tents, 3 in total, 1 for each of us, and another to change in and keep our gear in. Without making this long-winded, we set up camp a couple miles back from the truck, which we drove for quite a few miles through the trails, basically middle of nowhere. Nearest main road is probably 8 to 10 miles away. We arrived late in the night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after the long trip. We spent the next day scouting/tracking, then made back to camp for the night. We cooked and then ate, had some beers, and BS'd around. The night was still early, but we had a long day and decided to head off for the night. Everything up until this point was normal. I was suddenly awoke to something smacking my tent and hearing my brother's voice call my name. I knew something was off. I called back to him and he immediately unzipped my tent and made his way inside. I could tell that he was disturbed when I went to ask him what was wrong, and he immediately grabbed my shoulder and told me to shush. The sun wasn't up yet, so I think it was around 4:30 to 5-ish a.m. We sat in my tent, and what we heard still confuses me to this day. I can only explain it as whale sounds, different tones of extremely loud noise that I could feel throughout my body. It would come and go, but there would be only a few seconds of silence in between the sounds. It would vary from high-pitched squeals and everything in between to very low sounds that had literal ground-shaking reverb. I regrettably didn't think to grab my phone or record anything that was going on, because what I was hearing didn't seem real, and in the moment I was awestruck. The sound went on until daylight started to break. I believe it was about an hour, but I'm not really sure. Neither of us spoke, and at the time it felt like we could feel the energy around me, almost like my body was covered in white noise, if that makes any sense. It wasn't even minutes after the sound stopped that it started to rain, and one of the craziest thunderstorms while I was camping happened. The forecast didn't predict or account for any rain the days we were going to be there prior to making the trip. All the stakes for our tent, our gear was in, completely ripped out of the ground, and both of our tents had multiple stakes ripped out as well. Those things we drove into the ground with an axe and would make some insane force to unearth even a single one. My brother dismisses it and won't even talk about it, saying it was just machinery being dragged. But at the time, We both shared the same feeling of fear and dread. Just seems odd that it was still the middle of the night, and we were so far removed from any nearby communities/industry to hear and experience this occurrence. When I was growing up, we lived near a town called Welty in Oklahoma. It's not really much of a town, just a tiny store, some churches, and a lot of farms. We lived off of the main road, close to an area called Macabre, which is also nothing but farms and a cemetery, and not even considered a town. Very middle of nowhere. My dad told a lot of creepy stories about this place, especially having to do with orbs and weird deer. I do have memories of seeing floating orbs floating over the trees, and have no idea what those were, but I never personally saw anything else. My dad has always been a skeptic, and never chimed in on these stories. He has Alzheimer's and has a great memory of the past, but terrible short term. The other day, he was telling me how much he loved living out there, and wished he could still live there, and I brought up the orbs and the creepy stories my family always shared. He agreed that they were always creeped out there, but then he told me that he actually saw something really odd once. He told me one night he was sitting on the porch by himself, and a man ran through our yard wearing what looked like a deer head. Not just the antlers, but like he had on a deer's head. He just ran through and continued on down the pitch black road. My dad didn't know what to think of it. He just told me he thought people out there had too much time on their hands. My mom and brother also saw what they said was a deer walking upright, all the way down the road. I know deer do this, but they said it just kept walking like that in the middle of the road. My aunt also said they passed a man who was wearing a deer's head on the road one night. There aren't any streetlights in this area, so he was just out there in the dark road alone, just standing there. I'm a former, long-time airborne ranger, having served for many years in the 275 in Washington State. After my service, I was a Forest Service firefighter and disaster response contractor. Suffice to say, I'm very experienced in outdoors, professionally trained. In 2009, I was hiking in the Weyerhaeuser Forest Reserve near Offutt Lake in western Washington State. The preserve was adjacent to the home of a buddy's father, and before setting off into the lumber preserve, his father had implored for me not to go hiking in there alone, as it was a very dangerous area and a very frightening area. He had lived there for 30 years and refused to let his kids to ever step foot into the forest. Being a young, confident ranger, I laughed off his superstition and headed out into the virgin forest. It was an unusually hot and humid day in late spring, and I was armed with a Glock 19 9mm pistol and feeling very capable and competent. I had made it about 3 miles into the forest and came to a massive bowl section of perfectly manicured pine forest with no undergrowth, just tan spruce pine needle bed as far as the eye could see. It looked like I was stepping down into a forest bowl the size of a modern football stadium. I got about halfway down the bowl, and literally every sound in the forest became totally, deafeningly silent, all in an instant. It was as though I had stepped into a soundproof studio room in one step. No bugs, no wind, no ambient sound, nothing. By this time, I had been to combat twice and graduated ranger school and was a pretty salty individual, but I'm not ashamed to admit that I was overcome with a feeling of fear, dread, deep, guttural, paralyzing fear. I gathered myself together and turned around and practically ran the entire way back to Curtis's father's house, got in my truck and left, and never went back. I've spent years thinking about what happened in those woods, and to this day I have no answers. I was completely sober, fully aware of my surroundings, and in good spirits and health at the time of this incident, with no mental, physical, or psychological issues. I can't say what the incident was caused by, but I have never been so deeply in fear in my life. Even thinking about it now, over a decade later, makes me feel uneasy, as though whatever was in that forest is still there. All this I swear on my scroll to be true. In the fall of 1998, I went to Somerset, Vermont, to go camping along the Somerset River. A forest road runs up to an airfield with free dispersed campsites. It was first come, first served, and in the summertime it would be packed with all kids partying and living their best lives. Still, my girlfriend and I planned this trip in the fall because the fall leaves in Vermont are something special to see, and we knew the campground would be empty in the middle of the work week during the off-season. I set up our tent, and we walked around the woods down to the river and just enjoyed the season's natural beauty. We lay in the tent, talking as the sun went down, and drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up to two voices outside the tent. It sounded like two men whispering to each other, but it wasn't in English. I couldn't distinguish what they were saying, but I distinctly heard two male voices. Suddenly, there was a long, low whistle from off in the distance, and I heard one of the men make a click sound in acknowledgement. Everything was quiet after that. I waited until sunrise and went outside the tent and looked around. I didn't see anyone. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was wide awake. I woke my girlfriend up and we left. I still wonder where those guys came from, and why they used whistling and clicking sounds to communicate. The Somerset campground is far off the beaten path, and I didn't hear or see any signs of a vehicle. Rural Vermont has a lot of strange legends and folklore. Years after this happened, I learned about the Bennington Triangle and the disappearances of people in the 1950s. I left the state and I joined the Army a few months later. I've only been back to Vermont a few times since then, but I never camped there again. I came here, hoping anyone could share similar experiences or give insight. I took a trip to stay in a cabin in the middle of the woods high up in the mountains in the city of Ranger, Georgia, USA. This neighborhood was 30 minutes up in the mountains, away from civilization, and even the cabins were spread far apart. The front deck of the cabin was completely exposed to the woods, so I acknowledged that any animals could stroll along if they pleased. But I stayed there for about a week, and me and my boyfriend sat outside on the front deck every night, very late, and at no point felt in danger. It was peaceful with fireflies out and sounds of crickets every night. Until the fifth night. It was eerily dark too. The moon was covered heavily. It was about midnight, and all of a sudden I didn't feel peace like I did those other nights. The forest went completely quiet, and I felt a horrible sense of dread. I genuinely feared for my life. I sat there in my chair looking out into the dark forest trying to rationalize and calm myself down that it was just my mind playing tricks. But all of a sudden my boyfriend said out loud that he also felt unsafe. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. We then both heard a blood-curdling scream, and we pulled out a flashlight to see what it was. Turns out it was a gray fox. They make scary screaming sounds. The weird part was that the fox was just running and had its ears and tails down like it was scared. This was in June, and I read that foxes scream like that when it's mating season or if they're in danger. Their mating season is winter, and this happened in June, so I do believe that this fox was in danger or afraid, as well, adding to our fear. The cabin has 3 floors, and we were able to climb out the window and sit on the roof, because we wanted to still be outside and relax. Didn't matter how high up I was, I felt something truly evil and stayed inside. The only other time I felt something so evil, or like someone was watching me, was when I had a few paranormal experiences at a haunted house. Georgia doesn't really get mountain lions that often. Maybe a bear, but it didn't feel that way at all. It just felt so unnatural. About 3 months ago, I posted my experience backpacking in the Allegheny National Forest and hearing drumming, which I am chalking up to actual people banging on drums now. This weekend, we returned to the same trail system, Minister Creek. We set up camp at a different site about 3 miles north of where we stayed the last time. The evening was uneventful, and we went to bed in individual tents around 9:30. At about 2:30 a.m., we were woken up by a huge boom. It wasn't a gunshot. Sounded more like a black powder cannon going off. Echoed throughout the valley. We came out of our tents and discussed what we had all heard, a little on edge since it was so close to us, but eventually tried going back to sleep. The boom really has nothing to do with what happened later, but it was just a weird night. As I'm laying in my tent, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, I kept seeing shadows on the tent walls. I would swear I'd see a silhouette of a person walking towards the tent, but as soon as I'd look at it, it would disappear as quickly as I noticed it. I decide that I'm just seeing things and close my eyes, eventually falling asleep. Next thing I know, I'm being woken up by a young-sounding female voice saying, "Dad, Dad, Dad." I jolt awake, unsure I actually just heard this. So I'm just laying there. I check my watch, which says 5:13 a.m., wide awake at this time, and about 30 seconds later, right next to my tent, I hear very urgently, "Dad? Dad?" There was something off about the voice too. It was just creepy. I got major chills, like nothing I've ever experienced. Now A, my daughter didn't come with us, and B, there were no females in our small group. It's pitch black out, I see no flashlights. No more light from the fire. I'm trying to rationalize what I'm hearing and set up in my tent, thinking maybe a camper from another site wandered into our site thinking that she was at her dad's tent. I unzip my tent, shine my flashlight out, and catch a glimpse of a black bear walking off into the woods. I uncontrollably at that point let out a huge OF, waking up the rest of my group. Bear didn't care and just walked off into the darkness. So of course we were searching around with our flashlights and find nobody else around us. This whole experience was just crazy. What did I hear? Do black bears make noises that sound like a girl calling for her dad? Was it a ghost warning me that there was a bear in our campsite? A guardian angel? Or did I have some sleep disorder-induced auditory hallucination that just so happened to perfectly coincide with a black bear roaming through our camp? Either way, both of my experiences overnight backpacking in the Allegheny National Forests has been pretty weird. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them, and I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end of this video. I hope you get an excellent night's sleep. Good night, everybody. I'll see you in the next video.